Okay, it wasn't until April 4th of 1967 that Dr. King officially spoke out concerning the Vietnam War. So he never really said anything about the Vietnam War, the war in Vietnam, until April 4th, 1967. And it was on that date of April 4th, 1967, that King gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City. So on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King is going to officially speak on the Vietnam War at a speech he's giving at the Riverside Church in New York City. So on April 4th, 1967, at the Riverside Church in New York City, Dr. King officially speaks out concerning the Vietnam War. What are your feelings? Do you think he would be for it or against it?
Against it.
Okay, he's going to be against it, and if he's against the war, who else is he against? Lyndon Johnson. Remember, Lyndon Johnson's been a pretty good advocate for him in the Civil Rights Crusade, correct? So when he chooses to speak out against the Vietnam War on April 4th, 1967, he also is speaking out directly against President Johnson. Keep that in mind. Now, what do you think his argument would be other than loss of life? Obviously, we're concerned about loss of life.
Focus on the issues we have in here, our country.
Okay. And what issues is he pretty concerned about? Other than civil rights in general, what's another big concern? Poverty. He thought, very good, he thought that the money that we were spending in Vietnam, and when we get into the Vietnam, I'll tell you, it was a staggering amount at the time that we were spending in that war a day. He felt that that money would be best spent at home to help fight poverty in the United States. And he wasn't generally saying poverty only for black people. He was talking about poverty for everyone, which unfortunately at the time included a lot more African Americans than it did white people. So King believes that the money that's spent on the Vietnam War should be used at home in the United States to fight poverty. And that's basically what he states in his speech on April 4th, 1967. Now, unfortunately, when these comments get back to President Johnson, it's going to drive a wedge between himself and his biggest ally in Washington, D.C., which is the president. So it's a tough deal. He's really, hurting himself by doing this, okay? And so, but he does believe what he believes, even though it's going to drive a wedge between himself and the biggest ally that he has in Washington, D.C., which is the president. Now, it's kind of interesting because Dr. King was the first one to say publicly that there was no military solution to the war in Vietnam. He was the first person to say there was no military solution to the war in Vietnam. And when we get into the war in Vietnam, you'll really understand what he means by that. Okay, he said there was no military solution to the war in Vietnam. Nobody listens to that. They're shocked by that. You know the man that finally says the same thing directly to President Johnson that finally gets his attention? Guess who the guy is? No, that's a good guess. Mike Mansfield of Montana is going to be the guy that goes into President Johnson later, and we'll talk about that in the Vietnam War, that said this is an unwinnable war. It's an unwinnable war. Same thing Martin Luther King Jr. said, basically, on April 4th, 1967, but at that time it really shocked Americans that he would actually come out and say there was no military solution. We're the strongest military in the world. We can't come up with a solution in this little country of Vietnam, but he was right. Now, King's outspoken views concerning the Vietnam War really hurt his civil rights movement. I'm going to give you 3 examples of how him speaking out against the war hurt his civil rights movement. 3 examples of how his outspoken views on this Vietnam War hurt his civil rights movement. How do you think it hurt? How would it hurt him? How would it do that? What's that? Right, he lost support of some of the guys that were, some of the civil rights people that were following him. Probably of what race? White. So he had white people involved in the civil rights struggle that all of a sudden, maybe, I don't know this for sure, but it's sure possible, they could have had friends or relatives serving in Vietnam. And when he spoke out against the war, he would lose that support. So he lost support of some of his present civil rights followers, both black and white, but mainly white. That's one way it hurt. What else might hurt? If you lose support from people, what else do you lose? Their financial support. So he lost a lot of financial support for the civil rights movement when he came out and spoke against the Vietnam War. So those people that were supporting financially the civil rights movement that were upset with his viewpoints quit giving money. And finally, he lost support of a lot of Americans in general who thought that he should stick to civil rights and not get himself involved in foreign policy. Okay? What are you doing getting involved in foreign policy? You should stick with what you're good at, civil rights. You're not any good at foreign policy. You don't have any right to speak one way or the other on whether we can win a war in Vietnam. So it hurt his civil rights movement because people began to think he should stick to civil rights and quit worrying about foreign policy. Well, by that summer of '67, after he lost followers, after he lost financial support, and after people were critical of him to stay out of foreign matters, he became very depressed and he made a public statement of interest. So during the summer of 1967, Dr. King became depressed and he stated this after the criticism he received, the financial support that he lost, and the following that he lost. He said, and it's going to tie in, he says, quote, "I must confess that dream that I had that day has in many points turned into a nightmare." He said, "I must confess that dream that I had that day has in many points turned into a nightmare." So the dream that he felt and he spoke about on the March of Washington has turned into, for him, a personal nightmare. Any questions on Martin Luther King Jr. and the Vietnam War? He's not going to have much time to make many more comments because our next subtopic is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is going to be the second of 3 political assassinations that are going to happen between 1963 and 1968 in a 5-year period of time. In late March 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to the city of Memphis, Tennessee. In late March of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. travels to the city of Memphis, Tennessee. And the purpose of his visit to Memphis, Tennessee was he was supporting a strike by black sanitation workers. He traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike by black sanitation workers, which is a better political name for what were they? Garbage men, basically, okay? So he went to Memphis to support a strike that black sanitation workers were in the middle of against the city of Memphis. Okay? Now these workers had actually been on strike since February, and they were demanding better pay and better working conditions. So this strike didn't just start when Martin Luther King Jr. got there. It actually began in February of 1968. And the black sanitation workers were demanding better pay because they weren't paid the same as white sanitation workers. And they wanted better working conditions. My guess is they were getting all the crappy shifts, okay, weren't getting the benefits, those types of things. Well, Dr. King took part in a march of protest the evening of March 3rd, 1968. He took part in a march the evening of March 3rd, 1968, marching side by side with those black sanitation workers. So Dr. King marched the evening of March 31st. Did I say 3rd? I'm sorry, 31st. He marched the evening of March 31st, 1968, side by side with these black workers. And the end of the march, the march ended that night at the Masonic Temple where he gave a very moving speech. So he marches with these black sanitation workers the evening of March 31st, 1968, and they arrive at the Masonic Temple in Memphis where he gave a very powerful speech. turned out to be prophetic. What does that mean? What's that?
Future.
Yeah, very good. I think keep that in mind. So here is his part of his speech, and again, I just want you to listen to it. He said, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He has allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I might not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. That was how he ended his speech. What's he talking about? And what's he thinking about himself? He's getting kind of nervous about what might happen to him. Can you read that in the speech? Okay? I'm so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It was the last speech that Dr. King would ever make. On the afternoon of April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was staying at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. The Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. Kind of reminds me, have you been over behind what's now Cross Feeds, and there's that kind of motel that's down that way on Russell, and it's got that balcony on the top where they have rooms on top and bottom? Well, Martin Luther King had stepped outside on the balcony of room 306. His room was on an upper floor, obviously the third floor, and there were balconies that you could go outside your room, kind of like over there. So on the afternoon of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was staying at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. He stepped outside on the balcony outside of room 306 to get some fresh air. And he basically stood alone on the balcony. And as he looked down, he saw some friends below him, and he leaned over and began to speak at the friends that were in the parking lot, so to speak, on the ground. So he's standing on the balcony outside room 306 of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. He's getting some fresh air. He looks down and notices some friends and supporters down below, and so he leans over and begins to visit with those people. Suddenly, at 5:30 p.m., a single shot rang out. Suddenly, at 5:30 p.m., a single shot rang out. The bullet hit Dr. King in the neck. It tore away the complete right side of his jaw. He was shot in the neck, and the bullet tore away the right side of his jaw. Shot in the neck, bullet tearing away the right side of his jaw. He was immediately rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, and doctors desperately tried to save his life. He was rushed to local nearby St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors worked feverishly to save his life, to no avail. So King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. Doctors desperately tried to save his life, to no avail. So at 7:05 p.m., and this would be Central Standard Time because we're in Memphis, Tennessee. At 7:05 Central Standard Time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. So 7 p.m. He was shot at 5:30 p.m. Did I say a.m.? So 7:05 p.m. Central Standard Time, Dr. King was pronounced dead at the age of 39. Now, when news got out of this assassination, it set off urban rioting and violence in 40 cities across America. So when the word got out about King's assassination, it set off violent riots in urban areas in 40 cities across America. The most notable riots occurred in Chicago and Washington, D.C. So So Dr. King's death set off urban rioting and violence in 40 cities across America, most notably Chicago and Washington, D.C. Back in Memphis, 4,000 National Guard troops were sent to the city to back up police and enforce a dusk to dawn curfew to try to curb the violence. So back in Memphis, after the assassination, 4,000 National Guardsmen were sent to the city of Memphis to back up local police to enforce what they called a dusk to dawn curfew to try to curb violence in the city. No one was to be out dusk to dawn. So, and, that would be immediately to the next morning, nobody out. I haven't got to this point yet, but we will, because we got to get through the Vietnam War to make sense. Robert Kennedy, at this point, had announced his candidacy to run for president. And he was giving a campaign speech in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I gave you a handout of that I would like you to locate. And we're going to read through how that went for him. So in Indianapolis, Indiana, Robert Kennedy heard of the news of the assassination of Dr. King. He was talking to a crowd while he was campaigning for the presidency. No one in the crowd knew about the King assassination. Guess who broke the news to him? It was Robert Kennedy. This is what he said, and I want you to follow along. So find that handout that I gave you on Robert Kennedy. And this is what he said, because you can imagine this. And he's talking to a lot of people, both black and white. This is what Robert Kennedy stated while he was campaigning once he was given the news of Martin Luther King's assassination. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm only going to talk to you just a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee." And you can imagine the reaction he got when he said that. He waited. He said, "Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred towards one another, or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and to replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond these rather difficult times. So I ask you tonight to return home, to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true, but more importantly, to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love. A prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke." Now, can you imagine giving that speech free? He didn't have any notes. He didn't have any preparation for that. That's an unbelievable speech that he gave at that time. You know how much rioting went on in Indianapolis that night? Zero. And probably because of the words that he spoke at that crowd. That is one of the greatest speeches I think I've ever heard or read that came totally off the cuff, unprepared after an incident. It was incredible. And you'll get a chance to see part of it. Well, when President Johnson found out about the assassination, he also gave a speech from Washington, D.C. And he basically stated, "I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King." So again, President Johnson also gave a speech on the assassination of Martin Luther King. He gave it from Washington, D.C., and the most important line of his speech was, "I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King." Well, police now are going to launch one of the biggest manhunts in United States history. A $100,000 reward was offered for any information leading to the capture and conviction of King's assassin. $100,000 in 1968, probably $1 million today. Okay, so a $100,000 reward was offered because his assassin has fled. And that's going to take us to our next subtopic, which is a search for an assassin begins. We're going to tell you this story. See how many parallels you might think between this and Oswald. Okay? A search for an assassin begins. Well, what happens immediately after the shot is fired? Shot is fired. What do the police do? Just like they did in the Kennedy assassination. What got surrounded after the assassination in Dallas? Texas School Book Depository Store. As soon as the assassination occurred, Memphis police surrounded the Lorraine Motel looking for evidence. And in their search for evidence, they discovered that King was shot from a window of a boarding house about 205 feet away from the balcony, across the field. So King was up on the balcony here, and he was shot across the field out of the bathroom window of a boarding house. So it was discovered that Dr. King was shot from the bathroom of a boarding house across the field toward the Lorraine Motel about 205